We are now live, I believe. This Google Plus Hangout on Air is in aid of the Culture and Heritage Site Management Program at Centennial College, and in particular for the students of CHSM 706 Innovative Technologies. And I'm here talking today with Alysa Procida, curator at the Museum of Inuit Art in Toronto. Hi, Alysa.
Hello.
Great to see you online.
Yeah, and you too.
Thank you. So, listen, our students have been hearing about all kinds of things, uses of technology in museums these days, and but let's back off from that just for a minute, and let me ask uh, you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you first become interested in museums? What training and education have you had? Sort of what was your career path that led you to the Museum of Inuit Art?
Yeah, absolutely. So my career path is a bit unusual, which I think hopefully is helpful for students to hear about because not everybody needs the same qualifications. I actually studied English and art history as an undergrad student and then came to Toronto to pursue a PhD ultimately in medieval literature, of all things, originally. So I was dealing with very, very old manuscripts, old books, and I loved it, but I did not love my PhD program. And it turned out that I did not want to be a professor at all. But what I learned was that I love teaching. I love dealing with the actual objects, and I love the kind of intellectual stimulation of certain parts of my academic life. So when I was trying to figure out what would I do instead, because you work towards a PhD for years and years, and you're so single-minded that it's hard to have a sense of what else is out there. I actually started volunteering at a number of different places, including local museums in Toronto. I've always been a big fan of museums, as I'm sure most people who work in museums are. You grow up going to them. I grew up around DC, so we went to the Smithsonian all the time, for example. And I became a docent at the Batachou Museum originally and loved it. Just absolutely loved it. And so I started volunteering at as many places as I could, the Gardner, the Museum of Inuit Art originally, and learned as much as I could. I got hooked on Inuit art just from the very, very instant that I started working there. There's not a lot of courses in that kind of field, unfortunately. Even within Canada, it's a very, very small specialization. So my skills from graduate school actually really, really were useful in learning as much as I could, critically thinking about the art form. I read everything, articles, textbooks, talked to as many artists as I could. Met an artist, Kanangana Pudugu, like my first week there and just couldn't get enough of it. So I was very, very lucky ultimately that there was a position open in the education department where I was initially hired. And then, as you do in most small museums, you end up kind of having your fingers in sort of everything. And then eventually was promoted to the curator a few years later when our older curator had left. So I was very lucky, but with luck was a lot of hard work and independent research and lots and lots and lots of personal investment in it, which I'm sure everyone who works in this field can attest to. So that's kind of my very circuitous way that I ended up in my current position.
Super, thank you.
Mm.
And what about the museum itself? What kind of museum is it? How did it get started?
So the Museum of Inuit Art is the only museum in Canada devoted exclusively to art made by Inuit, especially south of the Arctic. And we opened up in 2007. We were founded by a small group of individuals. We're a public nonprofit, and we have a very, very, very strict mandate. We don't showcase any other art form really except for Inuit art unless there's very extenuating circumstances, which has happened in the past as a compare and contrast activity. And we've grown substantially in the last 7 years. So we started out with basically no collection to speak of, and now we have several hundred objects. And one of the things that we've been very, very keen on making sure that we're clear about is because we have such a specific mandate to represent art by Inuit within Canada, across Canada, is to make sure that we're very clear about what audiences we're targeting when we have exhibitions, when we have programming, when we have digital initiatives, for example. And so we define our audiences very, very intentionally, and that's people who come to the museum, but also people who can't come to the museum, specifically Inuit living in the Arctic, for example, but also off-site visitors who, for one reason or another, are interested in the art form but just can't make it. And so from our mandate, and thinking about how do we best pursue that mandate in terms of audience, it actually led to a really natural progression into a lot of the digital projects that I expect we'll be talking about today.
Great, yes, and thank you. I'm glad you mentioned digital projects because, of course, that's the main reason for asking you to speak to students today. I heard you speak, I think it's about 2 years ago now, about some of the digital projects that had been going on up until that stage. And I got the very strong impression, of course, that MIA has been a real innovator in using new technologies to engage museum visitors, and also that you have had quite an active role in those initiatives. So how did you first become interested in the use of technologies in the museum? And I'm sure something that everybody wants to know, are you a hands-on person yourself with technology?
I am now.
Okay.
I am now.
How did that come about?
Yeah, how did that get started? It's funny because up until starting at the museum, I would call myself like fairly typical for a sort of millennial in terms of my familiarity with digital projects, initiatives, platforms, whatever. I'm, for example, a very devoted Mac user because I don't want to be able to really mess up my computer, and my computer's very intuitive, right? Like I don't code really, although I do much more now than I used to. But what happened was I started at the museum, and our digital presence at the time was a Facebook page that no one had updated for over a year, and a very, very basic website that was not mobile compatible. So this was in 2010. Like I just want to be clear about this. A website that was not mobile compatible, that didn't match our brand identity. It was sort of green and had Java, and I mean, like, that was fine, but they used a lot of Flash, which isn't really compatible with a lot of platforms anymore, and that was very, very clunky to update. So we would actually have to update, like, our events, email our web guy, who was not a staff member, a list of things that we needed updated, and then hope that that translated properly into what we wanted, and then whenever he got around to it, he would update it. It ran on Joomla, which was not something that I was very familiar with, and is a fine platform, but we were using an old version, all this kind of stuff. So I was looking at this and sort of went, surely we can do better in trying to reach out to people. And this came out of a number of different ideas and sort of problems that we were facing, which are typical for most small museums, and I think pretty much all museums really. Number one, we didn't have a lot of advertising budget, for example, and so social media was like the thing to do in 2010, right? Like, oh, you have to be on every platform, and that's what you do, and that's how you reach people. And to not be on those platforms, to me, also seemed silly because you weren't building personal connections with people the way that you could. Additionally, our specific collection is so focused, as I said, that most people come in thinking that they know what Inuit art is, but that consists of soapstone dancing bears, for example, Inuksuit, the Inukshuks, like the Vancouver 2010 symbol, and that's kind of it, right? So we would constantly get questions like, well, who are Inuit? Do they even exist anymore? I don't understand what kind of stone this is. Where was this person from? I have never heard of Uluhaktuk. What is that? Um, so it seemed like, you can only put so much text on a wall, is the other part of this too, in the actual museum space. So I bugged and bugged my staff, my colleagues at the time, and I got admin privileges on the Facebook page. And then from there, started updating and instituted a Twitter account. And then eventually, we got a whole new website that we built from scratch on WordPress and started to pursue a lot of other initiatives, including things like QR codes inside the museum, which we don't use anymore, but was a really good, it was a good learning experience, and it worked for the time that we had it up. So a lot of my interest in digital came from this interest in connecting people with information that we had, but that just wasn't available anywhere. And part of that is because I think that's what the museum should do, and part of it is, frankly, it made our jobs easier in a visitor services capacity. Because people were enjoying their museum visit more, they were spending more time. We would have people come in who had asked us questions on the Facebook page, for example, and then wanted to see the piece in person. And so building those connections was the most important thing, because without people caring about you and your collection, there's kind of no point, number one, to doing digital in a way, but also, like, what is your museum doing if you're not serving people? Yes, you're preserving objects, but that only gets you half the way, in my perspective.
Great. So, what was the very first? You mentioned the QR codes.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first use? I mean, apart from you've talked about the website and getting into social media and so on, but with on the museum premises, was the QR code the first project?
So the QR codes were the first project that was really full-scale launched into the museum in a very fully integrated way. So this came out of a desire, as I said, to connect people with additional information, but also, again, to think about our off-site visitors and how they might access information or pieces in our museum. So we had a volunteer at the time who has been invaluable, named Rob Mouser, who is a web developer. And he and I had been sort of chatting about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could sort of just do something like put QR codes in the museum? And I sort of stopped one day and was like, well, why wouldn't we do that? It's very kind of low. It's low cost the way that we did it. It was very it was very easy to do. We created a special WordPress blog, basically, where each page linked out to a particular code, and we mounted the codes inside the museum, and that was it. The biggest part of it was gathering up the content. Very quickly, we realized that QR codes come with their own problems, as I'm sure everyone is now aware. Cross-compatibility was an issue across mobile devices. We originally, for example, and it's things you don't think about, like we started off with a bit.ly shortener for the links in the codes, but certain phones wouldn't read that because it started with bit.ly, not HTTP, which was something we had not anticipated, because why is that a problem? But of course it is. So that was a really interesting learning opportunity for us, not only in terms of things to think about, in terms of making sure that everything works on all platforms, but also in terms of visitor feedback. We actually had a woman come in and do a pretty large-scale visitor evaluation of that project that helped inform what we were going to do moving forward. We also found it really, really important very, very quickly to have rental, they were free, but phones available that had a QR code reader on them for people who didn't bring their own, because it's very, very easy for people to feel left out of these kinds of experiences if they're international and they don't want to use their data. So we had to install a free Wi-Fi network across the whole museum to accommodate this, for example, which was great for a number of reasons, and that served us really well since. But it was a lot of things that you sort of take for granted initially, and then sort of have to rethink your initial premises or your initial assumptions as you're working through it. And that's also when we started instituting some version, I would say, of agile methodology that's really popular among software developers, which has served us very, very well. And I would suggest people use if they can, particularly when doing digital work. So we would put a prototype up as quickly as we could to see if it worked, and then get feedback initially. And it wasn't this sort of like, oh, well, let's wait till everything's totally finished and then the project is done and we've spent all the money and then realize it doesn't work, right? So that took us about, I think it was 4 to 6 months in the end to completely have up. And that's in addition to other work and working with a volunteer who's there once a week. So it was ultimately pretty quick from the conception stage to the execution stage.
Yeah, I love the agile methodology reference and your description of that approach, especially with new technologies, untested things in the museum. There's nothing really to beat firsthand experience. Also, very interesting that you mentioned the evaluation study, visitor study. What kind of feedback did you get in that?
So we've had some interesting feedback. The people who used it thought it was very, very useful. We at the time were actually the only museum who had QR codes in Toronto in their museum, according to this researcher. So she had wanted to do quite a bit of comparing and contrasting, but it was only us. And so then she also did a library, I think it was Ryerson, had QR codes embedded somehow. So she stuck around for a while. And what we found was the people who knew what QR codes were and who were clear about what they were accessing really enjoyed the content. But for those people who had not as much familiarity with QR codes, thought we were potentially advertising something, or that they looked really ugly, and what is this? And we also got feedback that you get from people, which is, I don't want to be using my phone in a museum, which, fine, you don't have to. This is an option. So overwhelmingly, it was interesting because the statistics about the age uses were not at all what we expected either. We expected the QR codes to be very, very appealing to younger people, like 18 to 30. 18 to 30-year-olds didn't use them, like, at all. Like, not at all. It was people who were over 40, as I recall, and then younger people under 18 who had phones who were using them. So that was really interesting to us because we assumed it would be people who were our age. People who were our age just did not care to use them at all. So that was interesting feedback that we've been really, really cognizant about since as we move forward with other kinds of digital initiatives, trying to be really clear about who actually wants to be using this. And it seems like with the QR codes, what we sort of discovered after digging into this a bit more, people who were 18 to 30, I think, had been burned quite a bit by QR codes in the past. QR codes have a really bad reputation, for example, to linking out to like random advertisements or to not working all the time. And also that a lot of the people who were coming to our museum who were that age sort of wanted to unplug a bit from their phones for 45 minutes to an hour, which we hadn't anticipated. So that was really, really important to get the feedback stage. And I would encourage anybody who's doing a project like this or any kind of project where there's visitor interaction to try and get that information because it really, really helped inform what we did moving forward.
Great. Any feedback at all from the artists? A lot of your artists I imagine, consider themselves traditionalists, and on the other hand, probably a lot of them are young people with a very forward-looking outlook. Any feedback at all from that part of your stakeholder, shall we say?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. In terms of that particular project, it's interesting because the way we set up the pages where the QR codes would connect out, they were very easily shareable and also searchable. So you didn't actually have to link, you didn't have to scan the QR code to get the information. So we found that people were passing around in the Arctic and other places the page that we were sharing, for example. And a lot of the feedback we get from the artists is actually like, oh, this was my grandfather's piece. I remember him making this. And then you can sort of start to have a dialogue about, well, do you know anything about it? Because we have very thin information, and when did he make it? And, you can have a really interesting conversation from there. One of the key pieces that we embedded into the QR codes that we've continued to use and is one of the projects that I'm most proud of is our Skype chat series, where we Skype up with artists in the Arctic and then post the interviews on our YouTube page, uncut, uncensored. You get to see exactly what happens, exactly how I sometimes fumble through questions, and we have internet connectivity issues and everything. And it's not always artists that you would expect who are doing that work. So we've had everybody from a young playwright named Renelta Arluk, who splits her time between Yellowknife and Vancouver, to Jaco Ishulutak from Panuktuk or Panurtung, who is an elder, only speaks Inuktitut, and was really engaged about wanting to talk about his work with me over Skype in somebody else's house, right, with a translator. So those, I think, have been the most popular when we're able to reach out to artists directly. The biggest problem with doing that kind of work in this context is the internet connectivity issues in the Arctic are spotty at best, especially depending on where you go, and they can be quite slow. So downloading lots of information at once can be really, really problematic. But in limited ways, through Skype chats or Facebook has been huge, 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 huge. Everybody in the Arctic is on Facebook, absolutely everyone. And our visitors are actually able to talk to artists that way, which is incredible. We run this program called Playing Favorites, where we take pictures of visitors next to their favorite pieces. They tell us where they're from, why it's their favorite piece, and then we post it on a blog and also our Facebook. And we'll have artists sort of say, oh, that's my piece. And then the person will check to see their picture, and they're like, oh my God, I love that piece. And then they have this interesting conversation about that piece together that all we've done is facilitate by giving you a platform. So the feedback, I think, has ultimately been really good. It just depends on what project and how you interact with it.
Fantastic. I'm delighted that you talked about the use of Skype and so on, because this is something sort of I hadn't anticipated myself. This is use of innovative technologies, not just necessarily for engaging the public, but for research on the collections, for creating links between artists and your visitors. That's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, and I think it helps to demystify a lot of what we do at the museum, sort of in the background, and also helps to reach one of our goals, which is to remind people that Inuit and their art is not an old art form. Everyone's not old and stuck in the past and traditional and living in igloos. We get that all the time from international visitors, and I totally get where that's coming from. But these are people living modern lives often who live in a mixture of cultural traditions. And so what better way to demonstrate that in a way than even talking to Jaco Ishulutak, who grew up on the land, or Bart Hanna, for example, who we interviewed this way. They grew up on the land. Their work references a lot of that history and culture because it's important to them. But that they're sitting here on Skype talking to me, thousands of miles away, about how they also use power tools. when they make images of the sea goddess and why that's so important to them. So I think it's really, really critical to achieving our mission as well.
Yeah, I was amazed myself in looking at some of your YouTube videos to see the creation of a piece. The
Yeah.
guy, 90% of it was done with power tools before he finally got down to the hand smoothing at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And that demonstration happened right outside the museum. But again, if you can't be there, why don't we put that up on YouTube for everyone to see and to share? And that video runs in the museum as well. So I think one of the great things about digital too is that it allows you to create content and use it in so many different ways that you can access and connect with so many different types of audiences depending on how you're using it. So it's really very, very multifunctional in that way.
Super. Um, so I'm really interested in the QR code project, and the fact that you said you're not using them now. Has something else replaced QR codes, for instance? So in terms of the general objective of providing greater depth and richness to the information available in the gallery, adding multimedia and so on, have you discovered a way to move on beyond QR codes?
Well, we have slowly but surely been working towards integrating augmented reality into the galleries instead of QR codes. So a couple things kind of coalesced to sort of usher out the QR code project and move us in a new direction. And one of them was actually the visitor evaluation and then tracking the usage statistics of the codes. So again, another thing that I would always suggest to people that you don't necessarily think about is always have a number of analytic tools to back up your digital projects to see how they're being used and if they're being used in the way that you want, and also to justify the expense of time and of budget to sort of upkeep them. So people were using them, but they weren't overwhelmingly using them, which was kind of disappointing, but we left them up anyway because why wouldn't we? People were using them and they were achieving our goals. So then in 2012, it would have been 2012, we hosted a special exhibition of a First Nations artist named Christian Morso in one of our spaces. And my then intern, Brittany Hollis, who is now our full-time digital assets coordinator, wanted her project to be originally QR codes for the Christian Morso exhibition. I had just come back from museums and the web and was very, very interested in the discussion that had been surrounding augmented reality, and specifically the use of a platform called Mateo that requires like almost no technical expertise at all to integrate into your spaces. And it seemed to solve a number of problems that we were having with the QR codes. Namely, it would work off of one app, so we didn't have this cross-platform compatibility issue. It wasn't these kind of ugly boxes that people didn't really like. And you could just sort of swipe and see interesting things at your leisure. So we experimented with the AR for the Christian Morso exhibition. And it was really, really interesting, the different ways that that functioned. So it wasn't as shareable, for example, because it wasn't linking out to pages. But you could, for example, scan a painting and then see another example of his work. You would touch the screen and the work would sort of flip over, and then you could hear an interview that I had done with him about why this work is important, or some aspect of his relationship with his father, Norva Moriso, who's quite famous. And so she was able to complete that project in the course of 2.5 months of her internship, which is pretty impressive. So we thought, I think that this might be a better way to engage people on site, because by that time we had built up such a good list of other ways of engaging people off-site, and we didn't really feel like the QR codes were doing that as well as they could. Like they were not as well suited for both on-site and off-site visitors. So why not sort of separate those out into better distinct platforms? So then we sort of started working towards that. And then I got promoted to being the full-time curator, which was great. But I instituted a full-scale recuration of the museum. So that took quite a chunk of time to sort of reconfigure how things were going to work interpretively and where things were going to go. And so that sort of pushed back that project. But Brittany is still working on it. And I suspect that once she finishes this other sort of new platform launch for us very shortly, that will be the next thing that she's working on, because it is really important that people have access to this additional information. We do still have sort of integrated into the displays interested in more information, like check this website or interact with us in this way, or participate in playing favorites, or other things like that as placeholders, but it's not as robust as we're expecting it to be.
Tell me about Mateo. How does it work? Does the visitor have to download an app?
Mm-hmm.
If so, how is that app created, etc.?
So they do have to download an app, but it's not our app. So it's the Mateo app. And then what you do is you actually sort of scan what looks like a QR code to get to our channel. So there's Mateo hosts, they don't host, we host, but they host access to a number of different channels. So we're not the only people in the city who are using Mateo, for example, but you would come into the space and you would get the reader and you would scan up the code on the wall, and then you would be able to access whatever AR was available in the space just by sort of moving your phone around. We also included markers, like very small markers, where there was additional content. We hadn't originally because we were interested in seeing, oh, well, what happens when you have a seamless experience? It turns out the answer is overwhelmingly frustration for visitors because they feel like they're missing content, or if it doesn't work immediately, that they've screwed it up somehow. So I wouldn't suggest doing that. If you're doing AR, have markers.
So I take it that the Mateo app is cross-platform. They've got it available for all the major mobile operating systems.
That's right. I think technically the app is called Juneo, but the platform right. So the platform that we make the AR on is called Mateo, and then it hooks up with Juneo, and then you have that and you scan that. So yeah, it's for Apple and Android devices. The problem is then we weren't really able to have BlackBerry as included as when we had the QR codes. But even with the QR codes, BlackBerry was always the problem. And I admittedly have so limited experience with BlackBerry that we sort of decided when we looked at the usage stats, the number of people with BlackBerries coming into the museum didn't justify not moving forward with the project. So.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Mateo program, where does it reside? Is it online? That is where you create your content, or is it a download to a local computer?
It's a download to a computer. So we have a dedicated computer where Brittany worked on the AR project. And they were incredibly helpful because this was the first time we'd ever done it. And so we also were having issues with our server at the time, being able to host the content, and they actually did that for us for free, which was so nice of them because they thought that it was a really interesting use of augmented reality. It's incredibly intuitive. It's sort of drag and drop. So again, very, very user-friendly with very, very limited technical skills. So if it makes sense, and it's always interesting to me that when people sort of say like, oh, but how could we possibly do this ourselves? In some ways, if you can use iPhoto or if you can use Google, some of these are just as easy. And if you're interested in them, all it takes really is the time and persistence to make it happen. So very, very achievable.
So, is there an expense associated with this? If uh, I presume that you either have to host the content on your own server or on theirs. So, it'd be free if it's on your own server?
So to host the content on your own server, it is free. The Mateo program does come with a cost, but it's fairly nominal. I haven't looked at what it is recently,
But
but
it's
I
not in
believe,
the, not like in the tens of thousands like some of these
no,
things.
my God, I think we maybe paid $250
Yeah,
for it
yeah,
at the time. It was very inexpensive.
that's great.
And I think it was also like we only had one license because we only needed one person using it, right?
Hmm.
But yeah, and then from there, if you're hosting it yourself, I mean, you're paying whatever you're paying to host it, but it's very, very inexpensive. So one of the things that we do as well is we have our own collections management database. This isn't accessible to the public, but when you talk about digital and hosting, we used Collection Space, which is an open source database that we
Yeah,
configured, and we hosted on Amazon Web Services, and it cost us 83 cents a month. Like it's
pretty
nothing.
nice, pretty nice.
So, when you think about that in terms of your budget, one of the things that I know a lot of people do in terms of digital projects is they sort of wait until they get a chunk of funding, or like we're going to get a grant for tech, so we can do this project. For us, that has never made sense, um, because grant cycling is so kind of, you have to apply a year in advance. Technology moves so quickly. And in our experience, you really can do this stuff for very, very little cost. I mean, obviously, there's the staff time that you invest in doing it. But in terms of things like hosting and buying programs, and it doesn't need to be that expensive to be functional. So we just build it into our budget.
Good, good.
Mm.
Um, so, some of the collaborators you've had with these technology projects have obviously been Brittany,
Mm.
as I guess as an intern and now as a staff member. Is that right?
Correct?
Yeah, and Mateo.
Mm-hmm.
Any other useful collaborators along the way in getting any of these projects going or keeping them going?
Yeah, so definitely Rob Mouser, who I mentioned
Oh
before,
yes,
has been
yes.
invaluable in helping us. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my husband Kevin, who is a software developer, who helps me out of a jam every so often when stuff breaks. But one of the things that I think is important to also mention is in terms of collaborators, people like your executive director and your board, if they're really behind the concept, it's really much easier to do. And then also in our situation, making sure that artists and people in the field really understand what we're doing and why, and that they've been incredibly generous with their time and with helping us put these projects together. Um, in terms of other sort of outside tech people, we really do most of it in-house. So it tends to be Brittany and I. The rest of the staff are required to make time to participate in digital initiatives as part of their work plans, but that tends to be on a sort of social media basis, not a particular tech project specific basis. Um, but yeah, I mean, it takes a village the way that we do it in terms of getting the content together, and that's everything in our case, from things like copyright permissions to figuring out how to coordinate with the artists. The co-op system has been incredibly generous with connecting us with artists and setting people up with the computers in their homes so that we can talk to them, for example.
Wow. Um, so just a little bit of an aside, because you mentioned staff work on social media and so on. Do you have any thoughts in order for a museum to maintain a significant, I don't mean a blockbuster social media presence, but a significant social media presence? Have you any idea how many person hours per week that might consist of?
Yeah. So It depends on exactly what we are doing, and we've kind of gone through a number of iterations of this. We got really bogged down for a while in the seduction of being everywhere on every platform. And I wouldn't suggest that because that just sort of ends up being a bit of a waste of time if people aren't really using those things. But what we do that makes it a bit more efficient, I know that Brittany spends about an hour a week pre-scheduling tweets for the week or for the month. So if we have events coming up, and we use Hootsuite for that primarily, and that can link to the Facebook and the Twitter account, which are our two major social media accounts that we use. We also have a blog that takes a bit more time. So I would say most people are given about an hour-ish. They take about an hour to do a blog post, maybe every month or so. But so she'll sit down for an hour and a half and schedule out, like if we have an event on Wednesday, for example, on Monday, hey, don't forget we're doing this thing, and then link out to the Eventbrite page where you can buy a ticket, right? So that stuff is all pre-scheduled. But you don't obviously want your social media to just be call-outs of pre-scheduled things, because that's not interesting and nobody likes that.
Can't be all promotion.
No, well, like it's not the point of those platforms, right? Like you're supposed to be talking to people. So then we all sort of spend an hour a day, or, well, not even an hour, just whenever we have a couple minutes here and there, we'll check Twitter, or we'll check Unatsiaq News, or we'll check a number of different places that we look for things, and post videos that we think would be interesting to our visitors or respond to visitor comments and things. I know that Brittany and I have the Twitter on our phones, so if somebody is asking a question, we kind of get a notification no matter when that happens. And so we try to make it really interactive as much as we can. And it's not always about us or Inuit art. You know, we post cute polar bear photos and things like that because they're vaguely Arctic related, and people like them. But we also make a point of participating in things like Ask a Curator Day. So that took an entire day for me basically sitting in front of the computer answering questions that people had. On the whole, it is an investment of staff time, but if you do it smartly, it's not a significant investment of staff time.
Okay, now listen. You have mentioned what's going to be coming along with the augmented reality project, but at the same time, you offered a tantalizing hint of some other major project that Brittany was working on. What can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, I think so. We're meant to be launching on the Google Art project.
Oh wow! Great.
Yeah, which we're very excited about. So that should be happening soon. And I don't have the exact launch date yet because it depends on a number of different parameters, but we've been working on that and working with them. And we're really excited to put our collection up online for everyone to see.
Wow, so another collaborator.
Yes.
That kind of reminds me, you're mentioning your collections database, and as obviously as the curator, that's very much a matter of your area of expertise and responsibility. What route did you choose there to database your collections, and does it tie in with the Google Art project?
So one of the things we eventually want to be able to do is to tie the collections database in with having our collection online. One of the things I have struggled with, is the value of online searchable collections databases from museums. The Google Art project is a bit different because Google's platform links out in so many different ways and is so much more widely known about and accessible to people versus our website specifically. But I always sort of question, sometimes I feel like people do online databases of their objects sort of the way that they did social media a couple years ago, where it's like, you just have to do it.
It is the thing to do these days.
Right? Yeah. Whether or not it makes sense or it's done in a way that is useful. And frankly, I haven't been able to figure out a way to make that sort of database infrastructure useful to our visitors, and that will just require a lot more sort of evaluation, like preemptive evaluation, because that's a huge project that we would love to do, but just don't want to invest all of that time and money and infrastructure into to see it just kind of, it's there. People will search for polar bear, and then what do you do in that information, right? So the collections database currently doesn't link out to our website or anything else. The reason that we chose collection space, honestly, it's Spectrum compliant, so it met all of the requirements for collections management that we needed. And it was open source, so it was free.
Great.
We were able to build it.
Some of those packages are unbelievably expensive. Tens of thousands.
Yeah, and even if, I mean, and some of them scale depending on how many objects you have, right? But even still, I mean, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. The ones that, you know, the major ones people use. But we don't have that kind of money, frankly, as a small institution, to be paying that. And then that's how many years of a licensing fee, and then you have to re-up, and then all your information is there, and you're kind of stuck. So, yeah, collection space was a very cost-effective way for us to do it. And also, because we have a number of people working on the collections management at any time, it sits on the server. You can access it from a number of different computers. So it's networked. You don't have to just be at the collections computer. So you can have, like we did this summer, a number of different interns putting information up without it being a problem, which I also like.
So. Great. Any thoughts about some other alternative technologies for additional information in the galleries? For instance, NFC, near-field communication. Any thoughts about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that's really, really interesting. It's tough to say. In our situation, we haven't pursued it because of a number of different reasons, and part of that is, again, expertise, and part of it is time. I think that there's a lot of possibility for the integration of different technologies into museum spaces. What I think is really nice that's changing, or that I think I see changing in the field, is that people now are doing this, exploring these new technologies less to sort of be flashy about it or to be the first person to be doing it, and instead to be doing it for a reason. And I think there was a time a few years ago when everyone was sort of, but we need an app, but we need this. And so I think the rollout for those kinds of new technologies might be a bit slower than we had seen in the past. I'm hopeful that that's because people are really thinking through, is this the smartest way to have this information available? But I think I'm interested to see what happens primarily. I mean, obviously a little biased, but with AR, frankly, I think there's a lot of potential, but I also don't really see it catching on in a lot of different capacities. So we'll see. I know that there's been very successful AR projects in museums. Not really in Toronto. Nobody's really using it here. Mostly overseas. That's been happening. And I'm curious to see if people here will embrace those kinds of things in museum visits.
Hey, Alysa, thank you very much. You have it's been wonderful to have you to talk with on all of this in-depth look inside technology at MIA. And I don't want to take too much more of your time. There is a question that I think you probably be well qualified to answer, as I would say that you're a bit of a visionary
Oh,
and have been a visionary at MIA. What's your vision for the future of technology in museums, mobile devices? Where do you think it's going? Where should it go?
where should technology in museums and mobile devices go? That's a that's a really big question. I think that there's so much potential, and I think that a lot of what I want to see happen in any case, what I would love to see happen, is for museum professionals, for example, to stop quibbling over whether taking selfies in museums is bad or good, and just start. I hate that debate so much.
And realize that it's here, folks.
Well, exactly. Like, just embrace it, and I think ultimately this is the answer I have to that question. Meet people where they are. People bring their phones to your museum, whether you like it or not. And I know that some people are vehemently opposed to that. I remember I was speaking at a conference. It may have actually been when you and I met, and so we were engaging about something, and someone came up to me afterwards and was just like, I don't even have a cell phone. Like, how does this help me? And I'm like, I guess it doesn't. But most people have cell phones and bring them to museums. And I think you need to provide people tools that they can engage with your pieces in a way that's not too intrusive and that's not too flashy, and that you're not necessarily required to have your phone for, but that enhances the visit, because whether you like it or not, they're enhancing their visit with their phone one way or another. I mean, if that's taking selfies, if that's tweeting, if that's Googling, like, what do you mean by pre-Raphaelite art, for example, people are doing it. So I hope that it's less about trying to control visitor interaction than it is about helping people use digital in a way that they already want to. They just don't necessarily have a good way of accessing it yet. That would be my long answer to that question.
Thank you very much. That's tremendous, and it just has been a real pleasure speaking with you this afternoon, and I know the students are going to love it. Again, thank you very much, Alysa Procida, curator at the Museum of Inuit Art in Toronto.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to click stop broadcast. I guess we're done.
Sounds great.
We'll stay in touch.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye for now.
All right, thanks a lot.